Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
I'm happy to welcome Dr. Erick Winkle, Shuaib, who is working on a project to translate the entire 37 books of Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the opening revealed in Makkah. So let's hear from him. He has been working this project for long. He's dedicated his life to translate Ibn Arabi. He's a living scholar to introduce on the works of Ibn Arabi now in the world. So please, could you please explain for us, this work and how you started working on Ibn Arabi?
Yes, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ever since I was a teenager, I read a book called Sufis of Andalusia, which is a translation of some of Ibn Arabi's works. And it's a description of all of the awliya and very unusual people who are very close to Allah. And I just was so fascinated by them. So over the years, I knew that I wanted to read more about Ibn Arabi. At my PhD level, I was studying what was then called Islamic Revival. And I was reading Imam Ghazali and contemporary Sayyid Qutb and contemporary Islamic scholars and figures to try to understand the question of politics in Islam. And even in that dissertation, I knew that I should eventually come to Ibn Arabi. And I was able to come to Ibn Arabi quite soon after that, when I came to Malaysia, where I was hired on as one of the founding faculties of the International Islamic University in Malaysia. And this was an amazing experience. There were about 6 of us that we would gather every day and just spend the entire day brainstorming about what would an Islamic university look like. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And the scholars involved were just very inspirational. And around that time, I was able to meet people who had very deep knowledge of Arabi language. And with that, I began to study Ibn Arabi again. And this time with the help of this Arabi language, the beautiful language that came from pre-Islamic times until the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And anything after that is the Arabic language, but before that is the Arabi language. And so I studied that and began to read the Futuhat al-Makkiyah from the beginning to the end many times. And it's about 10,000 pages, so it's quite an endeavor. And then in 2012, I had been working at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies in Malaysia. And there, although that was such a wonderful job and I really enjoyed it, but I also knew that I wanted to dedicate myself to translating this Futuhat. And at that moment, that same month that I was beginning thinking of this very seriously, I got the critical edition sent to me from Sana'a, Yemen, from the critical editor, Mansub, Abdulaziz Sultan al-Masum. And his critical edition was so inspiring. And when I had that in my hands, I said, now's the time. I'll drop everything, leave everything, and simply translate the Futuhat. So in 2012, I began the translation. And for a few years, very difficult, having to support myself and family, but also having to translate this very, very difficult work. And the 2 things that kept me going, I said that anytime I don't understand a sentence, I will stop until I understand it, and give many prayers and dua for help in understanding. And so it would take sometimes weeks until I understood a sentence, but then when the sentence came, I understood. And the second thing I began to realize was that everything that he talks about, something that he tastes and he knows and he visualizes, and so it's very physical. So I began to see that what he's looking at is very physical. And so it's not a philosophical work. It's not a theological work. It's very much a physical, palpable, sensory description of the world that Allah has created and our interactions with Allah.
That's great, remarkable. So you told me that you started Ibn Arabi for a long time, maybe before translating those things. I'm wondering, whether it has any influence on your travel journey to Islam.
Yes, because so from the very beginning, I had this very special uh, love of Ibn Arabi, and the way he understands Islam is so beautiful, and it's we have scholars everywhere, in classical great scholars. We have scholars today, and all of these are helping advance the understanding of Islam. But there really is something special about Ibn Arabi, and he's just right now I'm translating one of these very short passage. It's about the ones who deny the Ma'un, and this is from Araita the Nukathibu Bidin. And so at the end there's those who deny the Ma'un, and so that's translated in English as those who forbid that people will help their neighbors and do and help out and give aid. And so when you read that, of course, it's very negative and it's kind of very ugly, and it's very sad that there are people who are stopping people from giving charity to poor people, for instance. That would be someone who is a mania, a denier of the ma'un, of these ways of giving aid to people. So when Ibn Arabi does it, he says this: there are certain people who all they see is beauty. All they see is the beauty. And so their allotment in this verse is that they hide or cover or veil the people from a ruya, from a vision of the asbab, of the secondary causes. So they hide the people from seeing secondary causes. So they want to hide people from seeing people who are being charitable to other people. So they hide them, so liyasarafu nazrahum, so that they could turn and inflect the people's vision to the musabbiba, to the one who has caused all these things, to Allah. So Ibn Arabi is saying these people, they deny these secondary causes because they want everyone to see Allah as the primary cause of everything. And so this same verse, which can seem quite negative or sad, turns out to be a beautiful one. There are people who are going to say, let me help people realize that only Allah acts, only Allah does. And so this is the Ibn Arabi. When we see that, we say, oh, that's Ibn Arabi. We know right away that no other scholar, no other classical thinker would ever say something like that. He has that. And so now you return to Quran, and every verse you read, suddenly you see it as a beautiful verse.
Wonderful. So you started a long time, and then you still continuing, and some of the volumes I know you published, and I have got some of them, the first volumes and all. So I wonder how it helped to interpret, because there are a lot of dogmas, and as you mentioned, that should be deciphered, in the religious sense. How do you see these things? This Ibn Arabi help you to find new narratives or interpretations?
Right. Well, so first, that whenever we're reading Ibn Arabi, I always think of him like he's someone who gives us a more direct access to Quran and Sunnah and the life of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's a more direct access. In other words, he wants us to go directly to the source, go directly to Allah. And so he's often citing the Quran that if you have taqwa of Allah, then Allah will educate you, will teach you. And so Ibn Arabi is always telling us that Allah be the one who educates you. Let Allah take the responsibility to educate you, to teach us. And so when we do this directly, it's quite beautiful because we go directly to the source. And now Ibn Arabi has said, and I've worked on this in some of the Zoom sessions. We've looked at something that I call "It's Our Time." It is our time. And Ibn Arabi talks about our time right now, which is kind of from his time onwards into today. And it's a special time. It's our time. And he calls it the third part of the night. So as you know, the third part of the night is the time when our cherisher comes down to the sky of this dunya and then asks, is anyone asking for forgiveness, for anyone asking for their separation to be covered over? And so we say, astaghfiruka, astaghfiruka, astaghfiruka. I'm asking you to cover over my separation. So this happens in the third part of the night. It's directly with our cherisher, Rabb. And so what Ibn Arabi is telling us throughout the Futuhat, and not only in one place, but throughout, he says that when Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he died, when he passed, we entered into the night. We entered into the night. And in the nighttime, we had the Islam that he was commanded to convey by Haqq, that what he was the messenger for, that was conveyed by two people. And we see them as Aisha alayhi salam, and we see them as Fatima alayhi salam. And so Aisha conveyed the Sharia, conveyed the outward Islam, and Fatima conveyed the inward Islam of the tariqat and all of that. So we have Aisha conveying this outward Sharia and Fatima the inward part. And so they were the ones who conveyed these things. And so as the night progressed, we got into midnight. And when you're in midnight and you love Islam, you don't have any light because it's midnight, but you know you want to follow Islam. So what do? Well, what happened in the midnight time is that people began to form this great big enterprise called the fiqh of Islam. And they began to codify, make codes, and write books and look at millions of issues and codify them and formalize them. So that, and these great manuals of fiqh are, in a sense, they're lights when you don't have any light. They're guidance when it's midnight, But Ibn Arabi says we're not in midnight anymore. We're now in the third part of the night. And in the third part of the night, the Rabb comes down to the sky of this world, asking, is there anyone asking for forgiveness that I may forgive them? Is anyone turning to me in repentance that I may turn to them? Is anyone asking of me that I may give to them? And so now we're in the third part of the night. We have a direct line to Allah. We have a direct line. And Ibn Arabi says we are actually closer to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam than anyone else has ever been, because this is his time, and therefore it's our time. So this tells us that we now, instead of looking at thousands of pages of fiqh manuals, we can now begin to look directly at the source, and we can learn directly from Allah, and we can follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ directly. And so it's a very special time. And so this has been an inspiration for me, because it's so exciting to realize that we are now able to ask directly what Allah wants us to do. See, in the past, when you're in the midnight, if I have a situation, like I don't know whether something, if someone pours wine into a stew, is the stew still halal? If someone says that this animal was killed this way, but is that halal? Maybe the animal was stunned first. I have all these questions. Every time I look around, I'm traveling and suddenly it's Maghrib time, but I'm in the train or I'm in a car. Now, what do I do about Maghrib time? What do I do about the Salat? So I have all these questions every day of my life about how to follow Islam. And Ibn Arabi says, we don't have to go now, open up a huge book from the 16th century, a huge book from the 18th century. What we all have to do is ask, Allah, what do I do now? It's Maghrib time. You called me to the prayer. What is my Salat going to look like? And then I find the answer. So what we find is that Sharia then becomes munajah. It becomes an intimate conversation. Sharia becomes munajah. Every time I have a hukum, an address, an amr, a command, then it becomes the moment for me to ask, Allah, what do I do now? And I look at the life of his beloved Prophet, and I look at his Quran, and I look at the hadith that he has had his messenger speak, and I look at all of these, and I directly understand that Allah wants me to do this right now, and that's how I do that. So it's a very joyful way of seeing that every problem that we have in fiqh is actually an opportunity for Allah to guide me personally at this moment.
That's great. You personally enjoy the life and also the translation. You are just implementing in your life itself. In that case, I asked you, because you are from US, the American atmosphere you are coming, and this Ibn Arabi text from another continent, the Arab cultural region. How do you correlate these things?
Yeah, it's very interesting that, well, Ibn Arabi has his own world, and he uses the Arabic language as his foundation. And so everything that he looks at, comes with the Arabi language. So what that does is that means he gives us the semantic field of this Arabi language. And so we go to Lisan al-Arab, we go to Taj al-Rus, we go to the different lexicons to understand what Ibn Arabi is talking about. And it's not cultural. So it's not Persian culture, it's not Arab culture, it's language, it's a language culture. So because it's a language culture, it can now be transferred and looked at in all different cultures. So we can go to European culture, American cultures, and we can look at them and say, this is the Arabi, the linguistic background of what I need to do. And now I start asking questions in these different contexts, in the different cultures. And so what the first thing it does is that it helps us realize that there is no culture which is superior or more Islamic or superior or one authoritative. All of the cultures have got to be seen as human cultures, and they all have their good parts, they have the bad parts. They're all human cultures. And so we need to, so when Americans say this is the way things are, I don't have to listen to that. I know how things are because I have this Arabic linguistic foundation. And so I can see things that are happening in North America that are good, things that are happening that are not good. The way I evaluate my position here is always through this what Ibn Arabi has been teaching me about how to implement and bring in myself this guidance from Allah into every step of the way. So that's very, very important to be able to have a strong criticism of every culture. And so I don't ever think that the way I was raised is the way that's right. I've changed my own culture many, many times. So I've been very, very flexible in cultures, and I've entered new cultures often learn their languages, follow their religions, follow their cultures and customs. And I've done that many times, and that was, I guess, a training to show me that we're actually building our own culture, which will be the Muslims will look different than they looked when they were in the 19th century, and we're going to create a community of Muslims who don't look like they would 50 years ago or 20 years ago. Things are changing very dramatically, especially with digital things, social medias, all of that. There are a lot of connections. We are changing very dramatically. And I think some people can get nervous about that because the Islam doesn't look like it looked with their parents or their grandparents or their old societies, and it doesn't look the same. But because it's directly to Allah, that's where we get our constancy and our beautiful foundation.
Yeah, just you were talking about this modern era and the science, other than because most of the people see Ibn Arabi maybe as a religious things, So more than that, you always mention that there is mathematics, there's a science, and all of the matters, in the modern world is there in Ibn Arabi. Could you explain those things?
Yeah, to call Ibn Arabi, to try to see only religion would be very narrow for him. So he's talking about everything. Well, one of the things that really inspired me is in 2010, in 2011, I started translating one part of the Ibn Arabi, it's the Futuhat. And in this part, he says about the inside of us. He says, inside of us, in our intestines, there are these beings, these tiny beings that can are almost invisible. And these tiny beings determine how we digest food. And if food comes in and it's good for us, these tiny beings digest the food and release it through, by going to, relieving ourselves, going to the bathroom. And if it's bad for us, these tiny beings expel them by either vomiting or burping or other things. And so he said, these tiny beings have an amanat, have a sacred trust to us, that they have to take care of our bodies. And then depending on how they take care of our bodies, that determines our physical health and our spiritual health, and it determines where we are on the dune on the day of judgment, and it's the day that we visit Allah. And so you have something here which is it blew my mind when I read that part, because only a year before was the first mention by scientists about gut bacteria. and the gut biome. And they were saying that there's tiny beings inside of our gut called bacteria, and there's more bacteria in our gut than there are human beings in the globe, and that these tiny beings determine our health. So there you go. So when I read that, I said, now here's why we want Ibn Arabi. Because first of all, he saw what scientists are only now seeing. But beyond the scientists just say they determine our health. Ibn Arabi says they determine our health and our spiritual health and our place on the dune when we visit Allah. And so that's why we need Ibn Arabi, because he has all of the things that the scientists are finding, plus he has the meaning and the spiritual dimension as well. So he does this with mathematics, with prime numbers. He says that prime numbers are, that nothing comes from 1, nothing comes from 2, everything comes from 3. And 3 is the first number, it's the first prime number. And he takes it from there, because if the world were a compound number and not a prime number, then there would be repetition. And because if you take a wave, and if it's always the same length, then eventually all the waves will harmonize and become one sound. But if they're prime waves, if they're waves that don't match and are never divisible by anything but one in themselves, then suddenly these waves will always be different and never have repetition. And so he calls someone like Khizr, he calls Khizr a prime number. And he says Musa alayhi salam is a non-prime number, is a compound number. And because Musa alayhi salam, he has to be understood by everyone. So let's say he's the number 15. So people who are 3s and 5s and 15 and 1 understand Musa alayhi salam. But Khizr is only understood by himself and 1. So you say a prime number is only divisible by itself and 1. And Khizr is understandable only by himself and Allah, the One. And that's why Musa alayhi salam can't understand Khizr. And so Ibn Arabi takes a mathematical truth and explains a very spiritual hierarchy or spiritual station of the prophets and of people like Khizr, like himself. So it's absolutely fascinating that these insights into mathematics, geometry, biology, chemistry, and he has the alchemy of felicity. And when he talks about alchemy, he says alchemy is the study of the measures and weights. And if you ask what is chemistry, the first line in your textbook will say the study of measures and weights. And so he has everything is there, and then everything and beyond. And so this is why it's so exciting. And so it's really important now for people who have scientific backgrounds and are searchers in the scientific field, have them to say, let's read Ibn Arabi, not because he's a religious scholar, but because he's a world scholar. he's a researcher of all these things, of all this creation.
Yeah, we cannot stop talking on his book and Ibn Arabi. I know that the time won't be sufficient for talking, and you have been doing that, the talks maybe for long years on his different kind of aspects and his approaches. So let us come back to your life, personal life, to ease the situation maybe, that, how do you feel, the Ramadan, and also when it was, when you first fasted, how was that feeling? Because maybe you don't have the habit of fasting in the small ages like others, so how was the feeling at that time?
Right. Yeah, there's two things that I found as a real gift that was given to me that I only realized much later. One is that I would read many hadith and then remember them years later. So that's the one thing. And the second one, the first thing is that what I learned, I understood some very beautiful insights to Sharia and fiqh at a very early time. So when I first became a Muslim, I was in University of South Carolina. I was getting a PhD, and it was my first time fasting, and it was very early fast. So I mean, I think like 4:30 in the morning or something, and then all the way to 9:30 or 10, it got very, very late. So it was quite difficult. And this was summer, and so in South Carolina in summer, it's 40 degrees centigrade. It's like 90 some degrees Fahrenheit, and it's wet and humid, so super hot and super uncomfortable. And so I was going to the registrar's office, and it's on the 3rd floor. And I went around the back of the building and I ran up the stairs, one stairs, two stairs, three stairs. I ran all the way up to the top of the stairs. And then at the top of the stairs, there was a water fountain. So I put the water fountain and drank some water. And then I stopped and I said, oh, I'm fasting. And then I realized, and I'm still fasting, because that didn't break the fast. That did not break my fast. And then I realized that, and I knew this, and this was strange. I knew this after being a Muslim for only a few months. I said that Allah wanted to get me some water, because I had 10 more hours to live with no water or food. But I just ran up the stairs. It's very hot. And so Allah wanted to get me water and not let me break the fast. So I did unintentionally, drank until I realized I was drinking. And then stopped. And so this is the beauty of see, that's why the Sharia is a munajah. It's an intimate conversation. It's Allah looking at me saying, this new Muslim has just ran up the stairs like a crazy person, and he's going to be so hot. He's going to have so much trouble. Here's how he gets water that he needs without breaking his fast. And so I began to realize that. So when Allah says, the fast is mine, as-sawm li, it belongs to me. And so the fast belongs to me. And so when we are taking on the divine, then we are fasting. And when we quit fasting, we're humans again. So what Allah does is that when if you can't be Allah, you can't be divine all day because I'm weak, then, or I'm sick or something else, then Allah puts me back into the human. So drink for 2 seconds as a human being, and then come back and then take on my qualities. My qualities: I'm not thirsty, I'm not hungry, I don't need food, I'm self-sustaining, I'm Hayyul Qayyum, and all of that. So it was something that I really was very inspired and encouraged to see, that even in the very beginning, that I was very personally led and guided. And so that was a wonderful feeling. And then the other, and just in Malaysia, I remember I would go out to the libraries and read Musnad ibn Hanbal's, which is like 22 volumes, huge work. I would read all these hadith and in Arabic. And then years later, I would come in Ibn Arabi and see a sentence. I say, oh, that's a hadith. And I would remember that I had read that hadith. So somehow Allah has taught me these hadith in a very painless way. Just naturally, I just read them for fun. And then years later, I'd say, oh, I remember these hadith. So it's been an amazing journey. I think what's so beautiful about it for me is that it's been a very personal journey. It's been one that as I go, that Allah's creation supports me and speaks to me. And today, in the last few months, I've had so many transformations and so many things happening in my life. And one of the things that keeps happening is that the creation has signs, and these signs come to me, and I see them, and they support what I know to be true from Sharia, what I know to be true from the fiqh, what I know to be true from the Sunnah, and they support that in each way. So if my mind starts thinking, I wonder if this is going to be easier, if I can handle this, then suddenly some sign will come. Someone will speak to me and say something that is a beautiful sentence. Ibn Arabi said this happens all the time, that there'll be someone who speaks Quran to you, who speaks revelation to you, and they don't know they're speaking revelation. So when one of the people did that, when they were praying with the Prophet ﷺ, and they were praying, and he said that Sami Allahu liman hamida. So when he said that, and then he said Rabbana wa lakal hamd, everyone said that. So Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then we hear the hadith is that qala ala lisan abdihi, that Allah speaks on the tongue of his slave, Sami Allahu liman hamida. And so that means, that's Quran, that's revelation on just someone who was there in the prayer. So someone may walk up to you and suddenly give you one sentence and say, you need to do this, or attaqullah, or they'll say something, and it's revelation. It's what you need to hear at that moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and giving very enlightening experience on Ibn Arabi and from your personal life. And hope we will have more chances in future. And looking forward to meeting you soon in Abu Dhabi, inshallah. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.